The Kentucky sun bore down mercilessly that afternoon, its heat pressing through the tinted glass of a silver Mercedes-Benz parked awkwardly on the side of a rural road. Inside sat Matthew Evans, a man whose life had been defined by success, comfort, and control. At 78, he wore his age with a kind of practiced dignity, immaculate white hair, pressed linen shirt, and a gold watch that glimmered faintly on his wrist. He was the kind of man who had built empires in finance, retired with more wealth than most could imagine, and lived in a mansion that overlooked acres of manicured land. But on that day, all of it meant nothing. Because Matthew Evans was stranded with a flat tire. The air conditioner hummed weakly, struggling against the thick Kentucky heat. Beads of sweat collected at his temples as he tapped his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel. He had already tried calling roadside assistance 3 times, but out here, where farmland stretched further than cell towers reached, his phone sat useless in his hand, no signal, no lifeline. Matthew leaned back with a sigh, frustration bubbling up inside him. He was not accustomed to waiting, and certainly not accustomed to helplessness. He had spent his life buying solutions, hiring people, and ensuring things went his way. Yet here he was, at the mercy of the road. Just as his irritation began to settle into resignation, he noticed movement down the stretch of cracked pavement. A figure approached slowly, a boy, maybe 13 or 14, walking with the steady rhythm of someone used to long distances. His t-shirt was faded, his sneakers worn thin at the soles, but his posture carried a quiet determination that caught Matthew's eye. The boy drew closer, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the car, then flicked upward to meet Matthew's gaze. He gave a polite nod, neither timid nor boastful. "Got a flat, sir?" he asked, his voice steady and clear. "Yes," Matthew replied, caught off guard by the boy's calm tone. Relief washed over him, mixed with an odd unease he couldn't quite name. "I was hoping for some help, but my phone seems useless out here." The boy smiled faintly, as though this problem were nothing at all. "I can help with that," he said, already crouching near the wheel with an ease beyond his years. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" "In the trunk," Matthew said, gesturing vaguely. Without hesitation, the boy moved to open it, pulling out the jack, wrench, and spare tire. His hands worked quickly, practiced, and confident. Each motion carried purpose, loosening lug nuts, lifting the car, fitting the spare into place. Matthew stood by, strangely transfixed. In boardrooms, he had watched seasoned professionals negotiate million-dollar deals with less confidence than this boy displayed while swapping out a tire. The contrast unsettled him. As the boy worked, Matthew noticed the details, the sweat-darkened collar of his shirt, the scuffs on his shoes, the dust coating his fingers. Signs of a life without luxury, and yet, no trace of complaint passed his face. He was focused, self-assured, and oddly dignified. Within minutes, the job was done. The boy stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave a small, satisfied nod. "All done," he said simply, as though the task had been nothing more than tightening a shoelace. Matthew blinked, almost embarrassed by how quickly his problem had been solved. He reached into his wallet, pulling out several crisp bills, and extended them toward the boy. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." But the boy didn't move forward. Instead, he stepped back, lifting his hand politely, his eyes steady. "Thank you, sir," he said, "but I don't need anything. Just happy to help." Matthew froze, the money still hanging awkwardly between them. For a man who had spent a lifetime defining relationships by transactions, service and payment, effort and reward, this refusal struck him deeply. People didn't just help for nothing. Not in his world. And yet here was this boy, walking away with nothing but a small smile. Matthew lowered his hand slowly, tucking the money back into his wallet. He got into his car, watching in the rearview mirror as the boy's figure grew smaller with each step, fading into the horizon. The Mercedes purred back onto the road, but Matthew barely noticed the smooth ride. His thoughts lingered on the boy, the calm assurance, the refusal of money, the quiet strength. It was as though a seed had been planted in him, a question he could not shake. Why would someone with so little refuse something from a man who had everything? That evening, as he sat alone in the cavernous silence of his mansion, that question echoed still. The boy had left behind no name, no trace, only an impression. And for the first time in years, Matthew Evans felt something unexpected, a humility that unsettled him, and a curiosity that would not let him go. That evening, Matthew Evans sat in the vast quiet of his mansion, a place that had once been a source of pride but now felt unbearably hollow. His home sprawled across several acres outside of town, with marble floors that gleamed under recessed lighting, chandeliers that sparkled with every flicker, and walls lined with artwork purchased at auctions he barely remembered attending. It was the kind of house that made visitors whisper in awe. Yet for Matthew, it had become little more than a museum of wealth, filled with silence. He sat in his leather armchair in the study, a crystal glass of 18-year-old Scotch resting on the table beside him. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, though most of the volumes on the shelves were for display rather than reading. The steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound, and each beat seemed louder than usual, as if mocking him with the reminder of time slipping away. Matthew lifted his glass, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. He had spent decades mastering the art of control, controlling markets, controlling deals, controlling outcomes. People respected him, feared him even, because he always knew how to turn a situation to his advantage. But as he stared at the untouched steak dinner on the side table, he realized something unsettling. He had not been able to control the image of a young boy kneeling in the dust to change his tire. The boy's steady voice replayed in his mind, just happy to help. Matthew had offered money without a second thought. That was how the world worked: time equaled compensation, effort equaled reward. But the boy had refused. Not out of arrogance, but out of a kind of integrity Matthew hadn't encountered in years. It gnawed at him, tugging at something long buried beneath layers of cynicism and self-preservation. Leaning back, Matthew closed his eyes. He saw again the boy's sneakers, worn down to the fabric, the faded t-shirt clinging to his shoulders, the dust on his hands. Clearly, this was not a child of privilege. And yet he carried himself with a kind of quiet assurance Matthew had never seen, even in men twice his age. For most of his career, Matthew's encounters with people had been predictable. Business partners always wanted a profit. Employees wanted raises. Investors wanted returns. Even in retirement, when he hosted charity galas or funded scholarships, he was keenly aware that gratitude often masked expectation. There was always something being exchanged. But not this time. This boy had asked for nothing. The thought unsettled Matthew more than he wanted to admit. It made him question things he had long considered unshakable truths: that everyone had a price, that kindness was just strategy, that nothing in life was truly free. The ice in his scotch clinked faintly as it melted, untouched. Matthew placed the glass down and rose, pacing slowly across the study. The carpet muffled his footsteps, but his mind roared with questions. Who was this boy? Where did he come from? Why did he help me with nothing in return? Matthew found himself by the window, looking out over his manicured lawn. The estate was immaculate, the gardeners came twice a week, the housekeepers maintained every inch, but for the first time, it looked lifeless to him. Pristine, yes. Perfect, yes. But lifeless all the same. He pressed a hand against the glass, the coolness grounding him. He thought of the boy walking away down that dusty road, figure shrinking until it disappeared into the horizon. For some reason, Matthew couldn't let it go. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, an unfinished thread tugging at him. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its deep, resonant sound filling the study. Matthew turned back toward the armchair, where his dinner had gone cold. He wasn't hungry. Instead, he sat down again, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The boy had shown him something simple yet profound: that life could be lived without the constant calculation of gain. That there was still a kind of goodness in the world untainted by greed or ambition. Matthew realized he wanted to see him again. Needed to. Not to hand him money, not even to offer thanks, but to understand. To learn what kind of life produced such a child. By the time he retired for the night, slipping into his king-sized bed in a room too large for one man, the decision had already formed in his heart. Tomorrow, he would go back. He would drive the same road, search the nearby towns, ask the locals. He didn't know exactly what he would say if he found the boy, but he knew one thing with certainty. This was not the end of their story. The next morning, Matthew Evans woke earlier than usual. The mansion was quiet, sunlight spilling in through tall windows framed with heavy drapes. Normally, he would have taken his time with breakfast, eggs prepared exactly the way he liked, coffee brewed strong and dark, but today, the food barely registered. His mind was elsewhere. The boy's face had haunted him through the night, appearing in his dreams, in the silence between the ticking of the clock, even in the faint whisper of wind outside his window. He hadn't felt this kind of pull in years, a sense of unfinished business mixed with curiosity and something he couldn't yet name. By 7 o'clock, he was behind the wheel of his silver Mercedes once more, steering back toward the stretch of rural road where he'd been stranded. The countryside rolled out before him, fields dotted with barns and cattle, the air heavy with the scent of late summer hay. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, just a trace, a lead, a chance. At the gas station where he first stopped, a young attendant in a faded cap leaned against the counter, chewing on sunflower seeds. "You seen a boy, maybe 13, 14? Matthew asked, describing Elijah as best he could. Thin, short hair, worn sneakers. Helped me fix a flat yesterday. The attendant squinted, shook his head slowly. Kids come and go, sir. Can't say I know that one. Matthew thanked him and drove on. At a small diner a few miles down, he tried again. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a bun, thought for a moment before shrugging. Plenty of boys fit that picture. Sorry. Frustration crept in. It would be easy to give up, chalk it up to fate and move on. That's what the old Matthew Evans might have done. But he couldn't. Not this time. He pressed on, stopping at a feed store, a roadside fruit stand, another diner. Each time he described Elijah, each time he came up empty. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, the air thick and humid, and sweat clung to his back beneath his pressed shirt. Still, he drove. Finally, late in the morning, his persistence bore fruit. At a small cafe tucked into the corner of a sleepy town, Matthew asked his now familiar question. The woman behind the counter, an older lady with an apron dusted in flour, paused mid-motion, her brow furrowing. Sounds like you're talking about Elijah, she said at last, wiping her hands on the apron. That boy's always helping folks around here. Lives with his mama over in Harlan. Matthew straightened, the name fixing itself in his mind. Harlan? She nodded. About an hour east, up in the foothills. Little town. You won't have trouble finding him. Everybody knows Elijah. Relief and anticipation mingled in Matthew's chest. He thanked her, sliding a generous tip across the counter before hurrying back to his car. The drive to Harlan wound through narrow roads that twisted between green hills. The landscape was beautiful, rolling mountains, thick forests, streams flashing in the sun, but Matthew barely noticed. His mind raced with questions. What kind of life did this boy lead? Who was his family? How did a child so young learn such dignity, such humility? When he finally reached Harlan, it was as if he had stepped back in time. The main street was lined with modest shops and brick buildings. Hand-painted signs advertised hardware, groceries, and a barber shop. People moved slowly, greeting each other with nods and waves. Life here was unhurried, simple. Matthew parked near the general store and stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He drew curious glances, his tailored shirt and expensive watch marked him instantly as an outsider. Undeterred, he asked around again. This time, the name Elijah was met with recognition. A man pointed him toward the edge of town, where the houses grew smaller, more weather-worn. As Matthew drove toward the address he'd been given, his heart pounded with an unexpected nervousness. He had faced hostile boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and commanded rooms full of powerful men. Yet the thought of knocking on the door of a modest home in Harlan left him strangely unsettled. Finally, he arrived. The house was small, its white paint chipped and fading. The porch sagged slightly, its railing patched in places with mismatched boards. And yet, it was tidy. Flowers bloomed in mismatched pots, and the yard, though uneven, was carefully maintained. Matthew sat for a moment in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel. He stared at the house, at the visible signs of wear and resilience. He drew a deep breath, gathering himself. Then, with a determination he hadn't felt in years, he stepped out of the car and walked up the path toward Elijah's front door. Matthew stood on the front porch, his knuckles hovering for a moment before he finally knocked. The sound echoed softly through the small house. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked, tailored shirt pressed to perfection, polished shoes gleaming in the afternoon sun. The door creaked open after a moment, revealing a woman in her early 40s. She had sharp, intelligent eyes, and though her face carried the weariness of long days and hard work, there was a softness in her smile. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" she asked. Matthew cleared his throat. "Good afternoon. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Elijah, right? He helped me with a flat tire on the road." At once, her expression softened, her eyes brightening with pride. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "He's always stopping to help folks, even when I tell him not to be wandering too far." Matthew found himself smiling back, though he still felt awkward. "He wouldn't take anything from me. I just wanted to thank him properly." The woman studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Well, you're welcome to come in. He's out back, fixing the fence. You can wait inside if you'd like." Matthew hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to stepping into strangers' homes uninvited. But something in her tone carried a sincerity he couldn't refuse. He nodded and stepped through the doorway. The house was small but neat, every corner reflecting care. The furniture was worn but clean, the cushions patched in places, the wood showing its age. Family photos lined the walls, snapshots of birthdays, school events, simple moments of life captured with love. On the refrigerator, drawings in crayon and pencil were held up by magnets, evidence of Elijah's childhood preserved like treasures. Matthew's eyes swept the room, and for a fleeting second, he felt transported back to his own youth. He, too, had once lived in a house where every object carried a story, where nothing was extravagant but everything was cherished. The memory stirred something deep inside him, a reminder of values long overshadowed by wealth and ambition. "Would you like some water?" Elijah's mother asked politely. "Thank you, but I'm fine," Matthew said, though his throat was dry. She led him toward the back door, where sunlight poured in through thin curtains. Stepping outside, Matthew spotted Elijah at once. The boy was crouched near the fence, hammer in hand, nails clutched in his pocket. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, but his expression was focused, determined. When he looked up and saw Matthew, surprise flickered across his face. "Hey, mister," Elijah said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Matthew smiled, though he felt an unexpected nervousness. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me yesterday when I really needed it. And I couldn't stop thinking about it." Elijah shrugged, his posture easy. "It wasn't a big deal. Just a tire." "But to me, it was," Matthew said, his voice firmer than he intended. He paused, glancing around the yard. The grass was patchy, the swing set behind the house leaned dangerously to one side, and the fence Elijah was repairing looked like it had been patched countless times before. Yet despite all of it, there was a sense of pride in the way the boy worked, in the way the house stood against time. Matthew drew a breath. "I don't think you realize what a big deal it was," he said softly. People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return. Elijah tilted his head, as if puzzled by the statement. I don't see it like that, he replied simply. If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I? Matthew was struck by the simplicity of it. In all his years of business, he had dissected motives, calculated advantages, and weighed risks. Yet here was a boy offering a truth so pure it silenced every argument in his mind. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Matthew said finally, meaning it. Your mother must be proud. Elijah grinned, glancing back toward the house where his mother stood in the doorway. She works hard. I just try to help out where I can. For a moment, the three of them stood connected by something invisible yet powerful: respect, humility, and quiet understanding. Matthew felt the weight of his own life pressing down on him, the years spent chasing wealth, the empty halls of his mansion, the silence that no amount of money could fill. He cleared his throat, pushing back the sudden heaviness in his chest. I'd like to do something for you and your family, he said at last. Elijah straightened, his expression cautious. We're okay, mister. We don't need anything. It's not about need, Matthew insisted gently. It's about what's right. You helped me, and I want to return the favor. Before Elijah could respond, his mother called out from the porch, her voice warm but firm. Elijah, you better come inside and wash up before lunch. And, sir, she added, turning to Matthew, you're welcome to join us. It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome. Matthew hesitated. He hadn't shared a simple meal in someone else's kitchen in decades. But something in her sincerity left him no room for excuses. I'd like that, he said quietly, following them toward the door. The kitchen smelled of cornbread and simmering vegetables as Matthew stepped inside. The room was small, its linoleum floor worn with age, but it radiated a homeliness his mansion never carried. A wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs, each one showing years of use. Elijah's mother, who introduced herself as Angela, moved briskly between the stove and counter, setting out plates. Elijah, freshly washed but still with damp hair, helped by bringing glasses of water to the table. His movements were quick, practiced. He clearly understood the rhythm of this household, every gesture woven with responsibility. Please, sit, Angela said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. Matthew lowered himself onto the seat. The wood creaked under his weight, but it was sturdy, dependable, like everything else in this house. He watched as Angela laid out a simple meal, cornbread still steaming from the oven, a pot of green beans seasoned with onion, and a platter of fried chicken that filled the air with its savory aroma. I hope you don't mind plain food, Angela said, almost apologetically. Matthew shook his head. This looks wonderful, he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. They bowed their heads briefly as Angela said grace, her voice soft but full of conviction. Matthew felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest as he listened, realizing how long it had been since he'd heard anyone pray with such sincerity. As they began to eat, conversation flowed naturally. Angela asked polite questions about where Matthew was from, what had brought him to their town. He answered carefully, mentioning business but omitting the details of his wealth. He didn't want to overshadow this moment with talk of money. Elijah, however, was more curious. Between bites of cornbread, he leaned forward. So, Mr. Evans, what do you do? You some kind of important guy? Matthew chuckled, nearly choking on his water. The boy's directness was refreshing. I suppose you could say I used to be important in the business world. I built a company, worked with a lot of people. But nowadays, I'm just retired. Elijah's eyes lit up. What kind of company? Construction and development, Matthew said. We built houses, offices, whole neighborhoods sometimes. Elijah's fork froze halfway to his mouth. You mean, you know how all that stuff works? Like the planning, the building, the machines? Matthew nodded, surprised at the intensity in the boy's gaze. Yes, I know a bit about that. Why? Elijah's voice grew more animated. Because that's what I want to do. Build things. Fix things. Make stuff that lasts. Mama says I should stick with school, but I like learning with my hands. Tools, wood, machines, they just make sense to me. Angela gave a soft sigh, shaking her head with both pride and worry. He's always tinkering with something. If it's not the fence, it's the old lawnmower, or he's taking apart radios to see how they work. Lord knows he's got the mind for it, but I just hope he can find a way to turn that into a future. Matthew studied Elijah, who now sat forward, excitement written all over his face. He saw more than just a boy with a dream, he saw a spark, raw potential waiting to be nurtured. It struck him how easily the world might overlook a child like Elijah, living in a small town with limited opportunities. But Matthew knew talent when he saw it. He had built empires by recognizing it in others. "You've got a good instinct," Matthew said, leaning closer. "And instincts like that can take you far, Elijah. Don't let go of that curiosity." The boy grinned, his teeth flashing, his eyes glowing with pride. The rest of the meal passed with laughter and stories. Angela shared tales of Elijah as a child, how he once tried to fix the toaster with toy tools, how he built a treehouse out of scrap wood. Matthew found himself laughing more than he had in years, the sound rusty in his own ears but genuine. When the plates were cleared, Matthew lingered, reluctant to leave. He looked around the kitchen, the patched curtains, the worn table, the chipped dishes, and felt something he couldn't find in his marble-floored dining room, belonging. As he rose to leave, Angela placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Evans. Most folks pass by people like us without even seeing us. But you took the time." Matthew swallowed hard, her words cutting deeper than she realized. "No, Mrs. Carter. It's me who should thank you. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." He stepped outside, the sun sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in gold and rose. Elijah walked into the car, still buzzing with questions about construction. Matthew promised, without quite realizing it, "I'll be back soon. There's more I'd like to show you." And as he drove away, he understood something new. This wasn't just a polite visit. It was the beginning of something larger, something that could change all of their lives. The following morning, Matthew sat at his breakfast table, staring at the untouched spread before him, eggs, bacon, toast, all laid out perfectly by the house staff. Yet he felt no appetite. His mind was elsewhere, still back in that small kitchen with mismatched chairs and laughter that lingered in the air. He thought of Elijah's wide-eyed excitement when he spoke of building and fixing things, of Angela's quiet resilience as she worked tirelessly to keep her household afloat. And then he thought of himself, sitting in a mansion full of things but starved of meaning. By the time his coffee had cooled, Matthew knew what he had to do. For decades, he had built neighborhoods, transformed empty lots into thriving communities. He had overseen projects worth millions, but now, for the first time, he wanted to build something personal, something that mattered not to investors or stockholders but to a single boy and his mother. He picked up the phone and began dialing. Old colleagues answered, their voices surprised to hear from him. Contractors, suppliers, architects, names he hadn't spoken in years, were suddenly alive on the other end of the line. Within hours, he had a plan forming, a renovation. Not a gift out of pity, but a recognition of the strength and dignity this family carried. By the end of the week, trucks began rolling down the narrow road toward Harlan. Neighbors peeked through windows as men in hard hats unloaded lumber, paint, and tools. The quiet little street buzzed with energy. Angela stood on the porch, her brow furrowed as she watched the commotion. "Mr. Evans, this is too much," she said, her voice trembling between gratitude and protest. Matthew removed his sunglasses and looked her squarely in the eye. "It's not too much. It's just right. You and your son gave me something I can't put a price on. Let me give something back." Angela shook her head, overwhelmed. "We've managed fine on our own." "You've done more than manage," Matthew said gently. "But you deserve more than patchwork fences and broken swings." Elijah, meanwhile, was practically bouncing on his heels. His eyes widened at the sight of power tools and lumber being stacked in the yard. He darted from worker to worker, peppering them with questions. "What's that tool called? How do you measure the wood so straight? Can I try?" One of the crew, a broad-shouldered man named Joe, chuckled and ruffled Elijah's hair. "Kid, you've got more curiosity than half the apprentices I've trained." He handed Elijah a tape measure. "Here, why don't you measure that plank for me?" Elijah's hands shook slightly as he stretched the tape, calling out the numbers with precision. The workers cheered him on, their smiles genuine. Matthew stood a few steps back, watching it unfold, his chest swelling with pride. He recognized the hunger in Elijah's eyes, the same hunger he once had as a young man eager to learn, eager to build something lasting. Day by day, the house transformed. The sagging porch was torn down and rebuilt with fresh, sturdy beams. A new roof went up, gleaming under the sun. Inside, faded wallpaper was stripped away and replaced with warm coats of paint. The cracked linoleum floors were replaced with polished wood. The rusty swing set in the backyard was hauled off, replaced by a brand new one that squeaked with promise rather than decay. At first, Elijah tried to pitch in, hauling small planks and sweeping debris, but Matthew insisted he focus on learning rather than labor. "Your job," Matthew said with a grin, "is to watch and soak up everything. One day, you'll be leading crews like this." Elijah nodded, though he couldn't resist sneaking in a little work, hammering a nail here, holding a board steady there. His excitement was contagious, and even the seasoned workers seemed energized by his presence. Angela often stood on the porch, arms crossed, still torn between gratitude and disbelief. Every time she looked at the new siding, the fresh paint, or the sparkling kitchen fixtures being installed, tears threatened to spill. "I don't know how we can ever repay you," she told Matthew one evening as the crew packed up for the day. Matthew's voice softened. "You already have. You reminded me what it feels like to be alive again." By the second week, the whole neighborhood began to take notice. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and mason jars of sweet tea for the workers. Children gathered in the yard to watch the transformation. What began as a single renovation became a community event, a ripple of hope spreading through Harlan. And at the center of it all stood Elijah, measuring, questioning, learning, his dreams growing brighter with each passing day. For Matthew, every nail hammered and every wall painted wasn't just construction. It was redemption. He wasn't just fixing a house. He was building a future. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air, and the sound of hammers had finally gone quiet. After weeks of steady work, Elijah's home was nearly unrecognizable. The sagging porch was gone, replaced with a strong new deck that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The kitchen sparkled with modern appliances, the kind Angela had once only admired in magazines. Even the old swing set in the backyard, once rusted and forgotten, now stood tall and inviting. The Carter home, once worn with age and struggle, now breathed with life. On the final afternoon of construction, the neighborhood seemed to gather naturally. Neighbors brought folding chairs, lemonade, and mason jars of sweet tea. Someone baked a peach cobbler. Children darted through the yard, their laughter echoing over the hammering of the last few nails. It felt less like a renovation project and more like a celebration. Elijah sat cross-legged in the grass, watching Joe, the big-shouldered worker who had taken him under his wing, carefully finish a railing. "See," Joe said, guiding Elijah's hand, "you measure twice, cut once. That's the rule. Saves you from a world of trouble later." Elijah nodded, committing the words to memory. His eyes glowed with excitement. "I want to learn all of it. The tools, the plans, everything. I want to build things, too." Matthew stood a few steps away, leaning on his cane, quietly observing. Every so often, Elijah's eager voice rang out, full of questions, full of wonder. Watching him, Matthew felt something stir deep in his chest, a warmth, a pride that surprised him. He thought of the boy he had once been, filled with the same drive, long before the weight of wealth and ambition had hardened his outlook. When the crew finally packed up for the day, Elijah came bounding over, his face flushed from the sun. Mr. Matthew, did you see? Joe let me hammer some of the boards myself. Said I did it straight. Matthew chuckled, his eyes crinkling with genuine joy. I did see, Elijah. You've got a real gift. Don't ever let that go. The boy hesitated, his excitement giving way to something more thoughtful. He sat down on the porch steps beside Matthew, glancing up at him with wide, serious eyes. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing all this? For us, I mean. You barely know us. You could have just said thank you and driven off. Why go through all this trouble? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He took a deep breath before answering. Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, he said finally. All my life, I thought success was about what I could gain, money, power, influence. But none of it ever filled me up. When you helped me with that tire and refused to take anything in return, I realized kindness doesn't need a price tag. You helped me without expecting a thing. That kind of goodness, it's rare, Elijah. And it woke me up. Elijah tilted his head, processing the words. So, you're saying I helped you, too? Matthew's eyes softened. More than you know. The boy sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. For the first time, he understood that the simple act of helping someone, even something as small as changing a tire, could ripple outward, changing lives in ways he hadn't imagined. Angela stepped out onto the porch just then, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She looked at the two of them, the wealthy retiree in his fine clothes and the boy in his worn sneakers sitting side by side, and felt her chest tighten with gratitude. You've done more than fix a house, Mr. Evans, she said quietly. You've given us hope. Matthew rose slowly, his joints aching, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. No, Angela. It's your son who gave me hope. I just returned the favor. That night, as the last of the neighbors drifted away and the stars appeared overhead, Elijah lay awake in his freshly painted bedroom. His window framed the glowing moon, and the air smelled faintly of sawdust and new beginnings. He thought of Matthew's words, of the truth behind them. Kindness wasn't about what you had, it was about what you gave. And in that moment, Elijah made a silent promise to himself. One day, he would grow into the kind of man who built not just with his hands, but with his heart. The morning after the renovation was complete, the Carter home felt like a different place. The once sagging porch now stood firm, sunlight streaming across its freshly polished wood. Inside, the rooms gleamed with fresh paint and sturdy floors. The refrigerator hummed quietly, filled with more food than Angela had been able to store in months. Angela walked from room to room in awe, her fingertips brushing against smooth counters and freshly painted walls. She paused in the kitchen, where sunlight poured in through new curtains, and pressed a hand over her mouth. Tears threatened, but they weren't the kind born of exhaustion or worry, they were tears of relief, of gratitude. Out back, Elijah swung high on the brand-new swing set, his laughter ringing through the air like a song. His sneakers kicked at the sky, his curls bouncing as he soared. He looked freer than Matthew had ever seen him. Matthew sat on the porch, Kane leaning against the railing, sipping coffee that Angela had pressed into his hands. He watched Elijah's joy with quiet contentment. For decades, he had measured life in profits and losses, in boardroom victories and acquisitions. But sitting there, surrounded by the sound of a boy's laughter and a mother's grateful smile, he realized the true measure of a life well lived wasn't wealth, it was connection. Angela joined him on the porch, folding her hands in her lap. I don't know how we can ever thank you, she said softly. Matthew shook his head. You don't have to. I should be the one thanking you. You reminded me of something I lost along the way. Angela studied him with kind but steady eyes. You found your way back. Matthew exhaled slowly, nodding. Yes. And I don't want to lose it again. Elijah came bounding up the porch steps, his face glowing with excitement. Mr. Matthew. Joe says if I keep practicing, I could be a real builder one day. He even showed me how to read a blueprint." Matthew chuckled, pride swelling in his chest. "I believe him. You've got the heart and the mind for it, Elijah. And when the time comes, I'll make sure you have every opportunity to chase that dream." The boy's grin widened, but then he hesitated. "Why? Why help me so much?" Matthew leaned forward, resting a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Because when I was your age, I had dreams too. People believed in me, even when I had nothing. That belief changed everything. Now it's my turn to believe in you." For a moment, Elijah didn't speak. Then, with a determination beyond his years, he said, "Then I'll make you proud." Matthew's throat tightened. "You already have." Over the next few weeks, Matthew became a regular presence in Harlan. The sight of his silver Mercedes parked outside the Carter home no longer drew stares. Neighbors waved as he walked down the street, cane tapping against the pavement. At first, they had whispered about the wealthy man who seemed out of place in their small town. But soon they saw the truth. He wasn't there out of pity. He was there because he belonged. Elijah continued shadowing the workers, his hands learning the language of wood, nails, and blueprints. Matthew arranged for him to visit a construction site in Lexington, opening the boy's eyes to a bigger world of possibilities. Angela, meanwhile, found herself breathing easier, her burdens lightened. For years, she had carried the weight of providing alone. Now she felt the strength of community and the surprising friendship of a man she had once only seen as a stranger at her door. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the cicadas sang, the three of them sat together on the porch. Elijah was sketching a design for a treehouse in a battered notebook, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Angela rocked slowly in her chair, her eyes soft with peace she hadn't known in years. Matthew leaned back, watching them, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "This feels right," he murmured. Angela glanced at him. "It does." Elijah looked up from his notebook. "You know what I think? I think this is just the beginning." Matthew met his gaze, and for once, the future didn't feel empty. It felt full of hope, purpose, and the kind of wealth no amount of money could buy. As night fell over Harlan, stars blinking awake in the velvet sky, three lives sat bound together by an act of kindness that had started with nothing more than a flat tire on a lonely Kentucky road. And for Matthew Evans, it was the start of his truest legacy.